So I'm an independent film producer from Australia. I have been here as part of the Berlinale Talents program. So we were selected for a program called the Talent Project Market. And so what that means in practice is that you spend your time pitching projects to distributors and sales agents and financiers and potential co-production partners. So I've spent the last 4 days doing back-to-back meetings. They run it like a speed dating. So where you sit down at a table with your director of the project and you have people coming to you every half hour. If they run over the half hour, you have somebody hovering over you to take that person away and replace them with the next person. So as you can imagine, it's been a very full-on few days. And really, I have to admit, in that time, not once has this idea of film being a cultural diplomacy tool ever come up within the room. You're spending your time talking about whether a film is going to work commercially, whether it's going to connect with an audience, how big is that audience, how much money do you need to make the project, and most importantly, how much money is going to be made from making this project. So it's really nice to actually be in an environment where we can put all of that aside and get back to some of the ideas about some of the reasons I got into film in the first place. My background is originally from New Zealand. And first of all, I think I'd probably like to talk about some of the reasons I got into film. It has actually, it's come up a little bit while I've been here in Berlinale. There was a film that I think is a really good example of all the reasons why filmmaking is so exciting and why it's such an important cultural diplomacy tool. There was a film called Once Were Warriors. Very, very small, independent New Zealand film, which came out in the 90s. I was 11 at the time, and it was a film that was so profoundly moving and talked about race relations in New Zealand, particularly the place of Maori culture and the marginalisation of Maori culture in New Zealand, in such a confronting way that I don't think I could seriously speak for 3 days. And it was the process of watching the dialogue that occurred within my own family once everybody had seen that film, that for the first time they were talking about race relations in New Zealand and talking about changing attitudes. And that, I felt, permeated throughout this whole of the country. And it's still a seminal film in New Zealand culture that really marks a moment in which there became a very open dialogue. It hasn't resolved everything. I don't really think that films are, going to be the be-all and end-all, but that really showed me at a very young age how much influence a film can have if it manages to reach people and to trigger a dialogue. So that's always been the base from which I have started my filmmaking practice. It's always been the kind of films that are most interesting. But I guess as I've matured, I've also, as you actually get into the actual marketplace, you know that you also have to, at the same time, make money with films. If you want films to reach an audience, they have to be films that entertain, as well as inspire, as well as provoke. A great mentor of mine said, and it's something I've always held on to, and I always, when I talk to students about filmmaking, talks about the producing role in film sits at the apex of business, innovation, and art. And so you're trying to do all of these things at exactly the same time, which is what is so interesting about the process, but is also incredibly challenging. And I think probably the more of a overt political voice you have in a film, like, for example, the film we've just been discussing, the more difficult it is to tick all the other boxes. However, I don't think that it can't be done. I think what I can talk about is the work that we are currently doing. So I work across a slate of projects. Some of them are films that are, creature features. I wouldn't say that they're probably the closest films to my heart. They're fun. They, are very fun to work on, very exciting, get to play with lots of things. But the films that are closest to my heart are probably the ones I'm going to talk about, because these are the films that I really feel like are doing what I got into film for in the first place. So there's a couple of projects that we are currently doing that are set in Afghanistan. There is a project called The Peacemaker, And this came from a very interesting place. It actually was originally a documentary project, and we were supported for development as a documentary project. And so I have been over as well, but my writer-director has done several research trips as a paid documentarian to go and start researching and uncovering this story. And we got so far with the story and then discovered that the security situation has become so compromised there that there are certain areas that we can get into, and there's certain areas where even our best translators who have most concrete contacts with the rural tribes are not actually able to safely get in there anymore. So as white filmmakers, it's become extremely difficult. However, this particular story, which I will tell you what it is in a minute, was so good that we decided that we couldn't leave it alone. We really felt that this was an important story to tell, and so we then began to work with everybody and suggest the idea of fictionalising the work, which is currently the path we're going down. And I guess it's one of those things, again, where it's going to be a much more difficult pathway for this film. It's going to be very difficult to finance because of the kind of film it is, but it's one of those stories that I think is so worthwhile that, very committed to the journey. So the story is a story of friendship, which has been inspired by these true events and real people. And so the process that we're going through with this is taking the participants, and they're very active members of the writing team and the producing team now. So it's a very collaborative process. And it's the story of an Australian surfer who, I don't know how many of you met Australian surfers, but they have a reputation for being very laconic, very laid back, very, very cruisy. Life is at slow pace. Everything's about surfing. This particular Australian surfer, though, was also an academic studying international relations, and realised that he might actually have to grow up and get a job. Without thinking about it too deeply, he applied for a job with the UN and found himself in Afghanistan. And because he was the only male member of the team, he found himself in the most complex and dangerous region of Afghanistan. His job as a UN negotiator was to try and get a particular tribe to lay down arms and begin to work with the UN for peace. He had initially the task of going to try and get a particular warlord to try and lay down arms. And so he was first tasked to try and go and meet this warlord. We're not actually using real names anymore, so I'm going to call him Rafi Khan. That's not his real name, but one of the other reasons why we decided to go down this path was to protect some of the participants that we were working with. They have had some very sort of close calls lately, and it's possible that we might contribute to endangering their situation further. So our guide, we're also changing the names of Jim Ryan, is tasked to go and meet Rafi Khan, a very dangerous so-called warlord, and his job is to try and just get him to have a cup of tea with him and begin to talk about what the UN might be able to do to work with him. On meeting him, the first thing he does is not offer him a cup of tea, which in Afghanistan is basically the equivalent of spitting in your face. And not only that, but then later he knows the coordinates of where his safe house is going to be and tries to bomb him. So then Jim returns back to Kabul, where he's based, and thinks, well, this has to be the end. I don't know quite what my role is meant to be here now. I've already failed. And through his right-hand man, a translator who also has very good tribal connections, his translator decides to go himself without Jim's knowledge and try one more time with Rafi and trying to convince him to give Jim a chance. Rafi concurs and goes to try and find Jim and begins a conversation for the first time, apologises for trying to kill him. And this is the beginning of what becomes a very great friendship between the two. They do eventually work together to bring much more security to the region. The way in which Jim works has not been seen before in UN's work in Afghanistan. So working side by side with a warlord who may possibly be Taliban, but actually making some progress and actually working with local people in a really concrete way where there's actually progress made and actually bringing roads, bringing schools, bringing things that they need, and most importantly, getting them to lay down arms. Later, after Jim finishes his tenure as a negotiator and peacemaker, he marries an African-American woman, actually, and they live in New York together. He's starting a new life, they have a child, and then he gets this email to say that Rafi Khan, his great friend by now, has actually just been imprisoned in Bagram, and Jim has to return to Afghanistan in order to try and get him out of prison. He has been suspected by the Americans of being in the Taliban. The Taliban suspect him for his work with Jim, and really he's wound up between a rock and a hard place. And Jim works to try and get him out of prison and manages to succeed. So all of that is those are the building blocks of the story that we're currently creating. So everything I've told you so far is true. So from there we are fictionalising it, and there's romance and other things. So I think that probably is a good example of the kind of stories we love to work with, where we feel that those stories can connect with a Western audience and look at a situation in Afghanistan and hopefully get them to think perhaps a little bit more about the media messages that they get and the assumptions that they make about what has happened in that war and the people involved in it, and just really make it clear that there are shades of grey in everything, that there's no one easy answer, and there are very good people who we need to care about and remember, even as the troops leave Afghanistan. So that's one story that we're working on. During the time that we have been working in Afghanistan, we also came across a group of inspiring young women filmmakers, and we have made a real connection with them and have also begun to work with them. The hope, and we haven't managed to, we're only just beginning talks and applying for funding and things, but the hope is that we can help them start Afghanistan's first female-led and owned production company. These three young women are very inspiring, to say the least. They're fighting huge hurdles, and they're very smart young filmmakers. However, a lot of the stories that they want to tell are not stories that are very easy to tell in Afghanistan. In fact, they've had a lot of doors shut. There's one story in particular that we are very passionate about helping them in any way we can to make, and that is, again, another true story. It's most likely that this is going to be approached as a documentary, and it's about one of these young filmmakers, a woman named Batul. And I would say Batul is probably the most courageous person I have ever met in my life. Her story is, and forgive me, I'm going to refer to the notes because I want to make sure I get the details right. Batul's story it starts after the separation from her husband, which is a whole other story again. And after the separation, her husband claimed that he was not the father of Batul's youngest boy. It doesn't sound that significant, but in Afghanistan, this not only means shame for Batul, but it also means, more importantly, that her son cannot get an identity card. And an identity card is only issued with the father's approval. An identity card means that you can go to school, you can have the right to travel, and you can have the right to access to aid and to care and to everything else. So Batul, for the first time in Afghanistan since Taliban rule, is attempting to countersue her ex-husband and the Sharia law court. A woman can get 15 years for adultery, and Batul has been accused of adultery. A man can get 2 years if he falsely accuses his wife of adultery under Islamic law. Of course, the only way to approve paternity of the child is a DNA test. And the only place that does this in this country is America's Bagram Army Base, which ironically is the place that we're dealing with in our other story. The trouble is the Americans won't provide a DNA test for anybody other than their own military or personnel, nor do they want to get involved in such a controversial case as Batul's. As you can imagine, everything that is done in Afghanistan by Westerners is done with a great deal of sensitivity. There's been an enormous struggle, much of which has happened underground. Batul has had some support to help her case. But after a couple of years, 4 evictions by 4 different landlords because of the shame, Batul has finally succeeded in getting access to a DNA test. 9 people accompanied the father to the clinic because he is a very, very powerful man in the Afghan public service, which made Batul fear that the results would be falsified. Thankfully, that didn't happen. The DNA test proved that the son is in fact fathered by her ex-husband. That should have been the end of the case, but sadly no. The reaction from Afghanistan's Attorney General was that Batul's actions were an abuse against men. That's right, the Attorney General. Her son still doesn't have an identity card, and Batul is still continuing to fight for the right to keep her son and to get him an identity card so that he can live his life in Afghanistan. Nobody wants to touch her story. Within Afghanistan, she has been documenting her story as she has gone along with these other filmmakers. But because of the extreme sensitivity of it, it's been very, very difficult to get anybody to help her in terms of getting her story out. So this is one of the things that we are hoping that we might be able to help with. When I'm at markets like this, where you're surrounded by financiers and you get some yeses and you get some nos and you have all the struggles of trying to get projects made and commercial viability and all the rest, sometimes I take a moment to remember Batul's story, and it makes, it all seem very, very insignificant compared to this work that we're doing. This work, by the way, is probably, hasn't got any hopes of being commercially successful, but this is the work that we're in it for. As part of the reason I'm prepared to face all, actually, I'm sorry, my partner Max has written that part of the story for me, so he's written a rather cheesy line I'm not going to read out. Thank you very much for listening. Is there any questions or anything else you'd like to discuss? Okay. Thank you. Did anyone understand me? Because I know I speak very fast with a funny New Zealand-Australian accent. You can tell me to repeat things.
How are you dealing with music in films about Afghanistan? As we know, the Taliban had banned music.
Actually, for a while we were following the story of the first rock and roll band of Afghanistan. That was originally how I became involved in Afghan projects. There is no longer a ban in place, and there is actually a small but growing music scene, particularly in Kabul, but in also other areas. I was there for the first ever rock concert in Kabul a few years ago. So there are Afghan musicians to work with. We're really at script stage at the moment, so we haven't got to the point of being concrete about ideas in music. But certainly in everything we do with these projects, it's important that we work with local filmmakers and local musicians, local talent as much as possible. So we'll definitely go down that road.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? We are very, very late in time. One question, yes.
Hello, my name is Janagul, and I'm from Kyrgyzstan. I'm just curious. Thank you for such a nice speech and presentation. And I was wondering if you want to extend your projects to other parts of Asia, or do you want to just be remaining in Afghanistan, and how do you get this ideas of the projects and?
Look, we're open to working with people all over the world. That's what's exciting about global filmmaking, particularly here. Being Berlinale Talents, they've chosen 300 filmmakers from everywhere, and so it's a very exciting way to meet people. So that's really, I guess, stories come out of ideas from people and relationships. So once we have ideas brought to us, or if we meet people and an idea grows through a conversation, that's how it generally comes about. And certainly we're not limited to working with people from Afghanistan.
One more last question. No question anymore. So thank you again, and we take some pictures.